all linked to childhood stuck. The hallmark of an illness that's often used for defining them is that it inhibits normal function. And in the 50s and 60s, people like Sandor Rado and Irving Bieber started to say that in their findings, and they did scientific tests that they really believed in, gay and lesbian and bisexual people seemed pretty dysfunctional, and they thought they could cure them and make them happier and turn them into straight people through therapy, and that it was all a matter of bad parenting. There's the Freudian legacy. The problem, or one of the many problems, was that Freud and a lot of the thinkers who came after him only ever spoke to gay and lesbian and bisexual people who were in therapy already, and ignored all the ones who weren't, who were functioning fine. But these ideas gained a lot of power to make people feel ashamed of themselves and make those around them, especially parents, feel like they'd done something wrong. In 1956, Dr. Evelyn Hooker conducted an actual scientific study with a control group, and she found that the gay men she investigated weren't really any more dysfunctional than straight men, but her work was covered up. The Nixon administration later got wind of it and tried to bury it on political grounds. So ironically, politics really was holding back the science, but just the other way. And tempting as it is to lay the blame for society-wide homophobia solely at the feet of religious authorities like Reverend Jerry Falwell, who definitely played their part, academics and doctors were in on it too, from the very beginning. And that's how it happened. Entire sexualities became medicalized, and then that diagnosis was used to justify taking away people's rights and talking over them, because they're mentally ill, so therefore they don't know what's best for them.
The problems start to creep in because inhibiting normal function requires you to define normal. And I definitely don't want to piss on anyone's chips, especially if psychiatry has been a help to you, but the philosophical concern is that psychiatrists' own conceptions of what counts as a normal, good life can creep into their judgment of who is deviant and therefore ill, especially if psychiatrists themselves aren't a very diverse bunch. Health can't really be defined without reference to some theory of a good human life, and one definition doesn't always fit everybody.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some standard questions now that will help us determine what sort of a service we think you might be right for. Over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of the following to the extent that they've impaired your normal function on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being not at all and 4 being every day? Little interest or pleasure in doing things you would normally enjoy. Feeling down, depressed or hopeless. Trouble sleeping or eating too much or too little. Feeling that you are a failure and have let your family down. Just on a scale of 1 to 4. The problem of defining the boundaries of health and disease isn't just an issue for psychiatry, but all medicine. For instance, you may have heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're a denomination of Christians, and a very small part of their belief system is they don't think Christians should get blood transfusions. And as you can imagine, it doesn't come up very often for them, because most people never get a blood transfusion, and most people think that you don't have to get a medical treatment if you don't want one. Most of the time. There's a big exception to that, which we're coming to shortly. But most people at least agree that you don't have to get a blood transfusion if you don't want one. So, Jehovah's Witnesses, you do you. But what do you do if a child of Jehovah's Witnesses, not yet old enough to make an informed religious and medical decision, needs a transfusion or they're going to die? In that case, you can't get around the fact that somebody, be they a doctor or a judge, is going to have to make a moral call between valuing the religious rights of the parents or valuing the life of the child. In my country, this has actually happened, and the High Court said that doctors are allowed to give blood transfusions against parents' wishes if it is medically necessary. Trouble is, though, that medical decision contains within it a moral and even a religious one about what is good for the child and who gets to decide that. The opinion of the High Court is, oh, we put morality and religion to one side and we just focus on the medicine. But by pretending to do that impossible thing, you actually make a moral and religious decision. There are no morally neutral medical calls, and every medical treatment presupposes that there is in fact a problem of a particular nature. Although we think a lot of the time that medical treatments should be voluntary, practically speaking, the big exception people make often comes with mental illness. Interestingly, although suicide is technically legal in my country, if you get caught attempting it, you can be arrested, as in handcuffs, threatened by the cops, strip-searched, and thrown in the back of an ambulance. You can be imprisoned in a psych ward if you are a danger to yourself, even though being a danger to yourself is a legal thing to be. And many of those who have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act in my country describe appalling conditions that are much more like punishment than they are like care.
An independent review published in 2018 reports that 2/3 of people sectioned in my country say they were not treated with dignity and respect. It's also worth noting that black Britons are 4 times as likely to be sectioned as whites, so race might be creeping into people's assessments of what counts as normal and healthy too.
In his book Fatal Freedom, libertarian philosopher Thomas Szasz gives a history of how suicide became medicalized. In my country, it was illegal to kill yourself until 1961. Long before that, it used to be that if you killed yourself, all your property would be confiscated and go to the state. And around about the 19th century, people started to think that that was pretty cruel, especially on families who were left behind, who were basically being punished for somebody else's crime. So lawyers started to use the insanity defense and say that if you killed yourself, you must be insane and therefore weren't criminally responsible. It was a legal dodge to allow families to keep their dead relatives' property. And then religious authorities got in on it as well. Previously, a lot of them had said that suicides couldn't receive certain rites or burials because it was a sin. And then they also started using the ipso facto insane defense. And that's why we today view suicide predominantly through the lens of insanity and therefore medicine. Whereas a lot of other cultures and peoples at different times just haven't seen it like that.
Вышел из корабля Алексей Леонов. Человек в межпланетном пространстве.
Now, we talked before about how homosexuality and bisexuality became medicalized into mental illnesses, and then after a turbulent political struggle, things changed. And the reason that might sound familiar is that right now we are doing that whole dance again, but with trans people. In particular, some transphobes point to the higher suicide rate amongst trans people as proof that it must be some kind of dysfunction, just like they did in the 50s and 60s for homosexuality and bisexuality, because the suicide rate for LGBT people is higher than for others. So if we can establish that suicidality isn't always a sign of insanity, mental illness, or dysfunction, then we'll be doing LGBT folks a massive solid by taking that ammo away from their persecutors. We'll presumably also be doing a lot of people a solid, because they might then be more open to talking about how they feel. Thoughts about ending your own life, or feeling that you would be better off dead? But that's no easy task, partly because we've been medicalizing suicide for hundreds of years, and partly because if not all suicides are the result of mental dysfunction, then that means that people who are perfectly in their right minds can rationally decide to kill themselves. And that's a pretty bleak thing to have to face for 2 big reasons I can think of. Firstly, even if 99 out of 100 suicides are the result of uncontrollable mental illness, like just a bolt from the blue, if it's your mother, or it's your brother, or it's your lover, and you're the one who's left behind, you're of course going to ask yourself, what if that was the one? What if it wasn't an uncontrollable mental storm, but what if it was a decision that they made in the moment based on certain factors in their life, and therefore what if I could have done something about it? What if I called them? What if I texted them? What was the last thing I said? Could I have saved them? And that line of thinking is truly the fucking depths of human experience. I've been close to people who've fallen into that, and you can spend your whole life asking what if questions again and again that you can never find the answers to. The idea that suicide is in its own bubble, it's like cancer, it just boom, happens and no one can do anything about it. That's an enormous comfort to a lot of people, and it's going to be really difficult to let go of that. Secondly, if suicide is something that, for want of a better word, rational people